wasn't particularly upset when the dead girl started moving. It was probably due to my dehydration, hunger, and exhaustion rather than bravery, but nevertheless, their twitches and jerks weren't enough to chase me out of my husband's office. When they started talking, though, that was another matter entirely. There were 2 women laid out on display tables in Michael's office. A pale lady with blonde hair and ivory skin who'd been following me for days, and a half-rotten woman who, except for mottled skin, curled toes, and receding lips, looked just like me. She was the more vocal of the 2. She kept spouting gibberish in a creaky, horribly wet whisper, whereas the blonde girl kept whispering for help. Cloudy gaze drifting emptily around the room. She didn't seem to notice me or anything. Her eyes traveled over me just as they did the walls, the window, and the decomposing doppelganger. Maybe she was blind, or maybe I'd ceased to exist. Either option was fine with me. My rotting double moaned, then hissed, "You have to make sacrifices, Rachel." Up until that point, murderous husband, false memories, bloody revenants and all, I'd done pretty well, but at that point, I was done. Hearing my name issue from that dead, cracked mouth finally broke me. I bounded across the massive office in 1, 2, 3 leaps. For a terrible moment, I was afraid I was trapped. The door to my husband's office had 3 locks inside, but it also has 3 locks on the outside. I'd successfully locked him out, but had he locked me in? He'd been begging me to come out for hours, but what if he hadn't disabled his half of the locks? "We all have to make sacrifices, Rachel." Her voice was a soft, dry whisper, leaves scraping against buckled concrete. "I have memories to show you." I turned the locks with shaking hands. One by one they opened, each giving way with a satisfying metallic thud. My doppelganger suddenly sat up, leaving a discolored puddle of viscous fluid on the display table. The door flew open, clipping my cheekbone. As pain screamed across my face, a pair of strong, familiar hands reached and pulled me out, then slammed and shut the door. "Lock it!" I shrieked. "Lock it! Lock it! Lock it!"
"There's no need,"
Michael said evenly. I shoved him away and tried to run. He grabbed my wrist, gripped like a vice. After a brief scuffle, he pulled me in, crushing me to his chest.
"Don't be afraid of me."
"You're a murderer." He drew such a deep breath that his ribs pressed painfully against my face.
"I need you to listen to me. Afterward, do whatever you want. You can leave. If that's what you want to do, I will help you. But first, we need to talk."
I should have refused, should have punched, bit, flailed, screamed. I should have done whatever it took to hurt him and get away. But I was so scared and so tired, so lonely and so lost. He's the only familiar thing that I have, the only thing I know. His embrace, that tight, crushing hold, was the first thing that felt right since I woke up in the forest. "Okay," I said.
"Good. Now trust me."
He opened the door before I could stop him. I drew back, expecting to see my dead double standing at the threshold. But no, it was worse. The room was smaller, so much smaller than it had been just a minute ago. Less than half the size, with desk and furniture scaled down to fit. The 4 large display stands, including the ones with corpses, were gone, replaced with podiums. No bodies for a blessed second. Then the room stretched again, everything erupting to twice its size just beyond the threshold. Wet things flickered into existence behind the podiums, dark bones imperfectly coated with sinew and damaged flesh, slowly building their way into broken bodies. One had unmistakable blonde hair peeking through her ruined scalp. One still looked just like me. A kind of wet, labored thumping caught my attention. It came from the 3rd podium, which had been an empty table just a moment ago. The thing making the sound was fleshy and small, bloody and dark, pulsating violently as if it were trying to jump away. A heart. A disembodied heart shot through with veins of rot and glistening white worms. It flailed, squirting strings of pus and coagulated blood with each irregular beat. One heavy lurch dislodged a maggot, shooting it across the room, slapping the floor inches from my feet. Michael shoved me back, and I stomped on the worm. The thick squelch made my gorge rise. "What is this?" I asked. My eyes darted back and forth, trapped on the rotten body of my doppelganger before catching on the burnt body of the blonde woman, all serenaded by the heart's awful, corruptive beat.
Come into the kitchen,
Michael said gently. He got behind me and placed both hands on my shoulders. Some of my horror dissipated. In fact, I was almost calm. I let him guide me into the dining room. He fed me dinner. Neither of us spoke while I ate, which was fine. So fine, in fact, that I found myself chewing longer and dragging out the time between bites. But it came to an end, as all things do, and eventually I pushed my plate away and raised my eyes to my husband's face.
I need you to come outside,
he said. So I did. He led me by the hand across our property. It was huge, so much larger than I remembered. Behind the house, already situated at least 100 yards from the road, was a steep slope. Beyond that lay a miniature plain lined with eucalyptus and fruit trees. Their leaves glinted under the moonlight, creating a dim ring of silver. Michael pulled me in among the trees. We moved too quickly. Rocks and fallen branches lurked in the shadows. I must have tripped 6 or 7 times before we reached the pit. Perfectly round and ringed in stones, it looked like a still, black pool in the darkness. I thought it was water until my toes were touching the rim. Michael pulled me back sharply, and I saw that it wasn't a pool, it was a pit. A horrific flash of memory hurtled through my mind. We love it when you scream. But I shoved it away. This was not the time for dreams or even memories, however important. What is it? I asked.
A gate, I suppose.
I turned around to look at him, to search his face for something, for anything. His eyes were terribly bright in the dark, heterochromatic, one green and one blue, eyes I usually found intoxicating, but tonight only seemed very wrong. To what?
Shall I tell you what you told me many years ago?
If it's relevant. He gave me a small smile, then recited as if by heart.
Beyond the empire we do not see lies a world we cannot imagine.
His eyes were too intent, too bright, the eyes of a fanatic. I looked away from him and at the pit instead, and immediately regretted it. No longer serene, the pit gaped, a wound bleeding even more shadows into the night.
The world we can't imagine is coveted by the people who own us.
None of this was familiar, not a word. Was it another lie or another delusion?
Even though they want it, they don't understand what they can do with it. They're too mired in their own wealth and fleeting power. They are so small-minded, so obsessed and assured of their place that they ignore the entire apple tree for the spoiled fruit on the ground. They understand only the tide pool, with no concern for the ocean beyond it.
Wait, that was familiar. The image of tidal pools, black tide pools under a green sky, sea foam fired to bloody copper by a red sun.
They think everything is for them. The only interest they have in this world, this vast, incomprehensible ocean, is in using it, manipulating it to solidify their power and money here. They think they can control the ocean. They think they can force the sea to fill their tide pool to the brim, and send it away when they're done with it.
The black ocean roiled, jagged peaks of black, glistening flesh crested over the waves, then rose and rose and rose until it blacked out the sky and blotted out the sun. Then it opened, an eye, a great single eye as bright as the stars and dark as the abyss, and then it opened on another one, and another, and another, until 1,000 eyes filled the body and the sky. Michael shifted. Twigs crackled and dry dirt rustled beneath his feet, shattering my reverie.
They can't get into this ocean, Rachel, but we can. They send us to gather its water for their own ends, without understanding what they're drinking.
His hand was wrapped around mine, familiar fingers gently lacing between my own.
Do you remember this?
I shook my head. Nausea roiled in my stomach, and my head felt light. Shadows were too dark, blending into the glassy, dizzying brightness of the moon on the trees and dirt and pit.
But you feel it, and that's enough. I'm going to show you what you showed me many years ago.
He wrapped an arm around my waist, fingertips pressing into my stomach, holding tight. I couldn't move if I'd wanted to. He moved toward the pit, forcing me along with him. The blinding moonlight and consuming shadows mesmerized me. I felt like I had a fever, that the trees and ground and moon would break their bounds and spill out, bleeding together and creating something new. something I could not and never would understand. Michael stepped off the rim of the pit, and before I knew what had happened, we were falling. Falling. And then I was standing, instinctively digging my heels into wet ground as gales of wind pummeled the earth, driving up cyclones of sand and shells that stung my face and bit my hands. A wild, unearthly sky swirled with ethereal green and deep pearlescent blue, stretching to a bank of hideous brown storm clouds on the far horizon. Beneath it lay a vast ocean. At first glance, black, but in truth too rich with color to comprehend. Blazing silver and rich ruby red, sapphire and emerald and white and gold, all deepened by colors I couldn't name or even compare to the ones I knew. Something beyond fear, beyond panic or terror or horror, suffused me. It was almost paralytic, but not quite. My mind was too shallow, too nascent, too unformed to fully understand, and thus, unable to fully react, I was just an ant witnessing the explosion of an atomic bomb. Out of the incomprehensible distance, something between the storms and the shore, were figures. Great, unnatural wreaths of shadow flailing and roiling in the waves. I couldn't look at them for long. I tried, but physically couldn't. No matter how I focused, my head would turn, or my eyes would look up to the sky or down at the sand. My body knew what my mind refused to accept. Whatever they were, I was not capable of seeing them. I tried to move forward, to explore, to go down to the water and touch it, but Michael's arm tightened hysterically around my waist, forcing me to stay in place.
Do you remember?
And even though he screamed, I had to struggle to hear him, because the wind picked up his words and carried them away. Perhaps to the beings in the water, I didn't want them to have my words, to know my voice, so I shook my head. He pulled me back. It was much easier than going forward because the wind was on our side. He turned and pointed. I struggled to see through the rain of the sand and the debris 100 shapes, 1,000 rocks and cliffs and alien trees, mountains in the distance ringed by violet clouds. Then I saw it, or rather, them. A man and a woman, both extraordinarily beautiful, with perfect mouths and a chiseled smoothness on the planes of their faces. But that perfection ended at the nose. From forehead to eye, their faces were wet death's heads, the woman hid in the water, staring up at the man, who peered down from a cliff. Fury and sorrow, lust and hate emanated from their bodies. Even from such a distance, it was a nearly physical force. It broke my heart and made me ecstatic and angry all at once. Michael covered my eyes, filled with visions of apocalyptic storms and wet skulls, of being thrown in churning seas and abandoned again. I flailed and kicked and even tried to bite him, but he was too strong. He always was and will be for a long while yet. I was trapped. Whatever he wanted to do would be done. And suddenly, it was warm and quiet. I was gagging on clouds of dry dust, curled on my side, somewhere in my husband's orange grove as stars and satellites glimmered overhead. I disentangled myself from Michael and sat up. Where did we go?
You never told me where or what it was.
He sat up with a grimace and shook dust and sand from his hair. Reflexively, I ran my fingers through mine. Sure enough, it was damp and flecked with sand and frizzy. I started to laugh, and of course, that quickly developed into crying. I thought of the man and the woman, of the beauty of their mouths and bodies juxtaposed against the wet, fungal horror of their eyes. Of blonde stalkers and dead doppelgangers, of old men laughing at screaming girls and bull-headed monsters prowling streets where forgotten victims tried to live. Michael reached for my hands, but I flung them away. I still don't understand.
Tell me what you don't understand.
I shrieked a volley of questions. What is any of this? How did I forget? Why do people know me everywhere I go? And why the ever-loving fuck are there dead women in your house? My voice echoed off the trees, hysterically accusatory.
I don't know,
Michael answered.
You brought them here.
A sob caught in my throat. I couldn't breathe, couldn't even choke.
You brought them here from that other place, that other plane.
He propped himself up and looked at me. He didn't look his age tonight, not even close. If I hadn't known him, I'd have guessed 20 years younger, maybe more, and beautiful as always. I looked away quickly, unexpectedly disturbed, and struggled to remember his words. It was hard, My mind was a mess, a buzzing, whirling, screaming mess. What had he said? We gather water for people who don't even know what they're drinking? Who do we gather the water for? He sat up, demeanor suddenly cold.
The people who own us.
Who owns us?
This is not something I will tell you tonight.
His voice was suddenly so thick, so much so it was unfamiliar. Between it and the distance in his body language, he might have been a stranger.
Come.
He stood up, brushed himself off, and extended a hand to me. I stared up at him uncertainly, then took it. He hauled me to my feet and led me back to the house. The clock in the living room said it was 3:42 in the morning. We'd set out at 8:30 in the evening. We reached the pit within 10 minutes. The foray into that other place couldn't have been more than a minute or two, but here we are, 7 hours later. Michael readied for bed wordlessly. I tried to follow his lead, but I had one more question. One I was sure he had the answer to. I had a dream the other night, I said.
And?
He was scrubbing his face, rinsing the sand from his skin and beard and hair. Actually, I think it was a memory.
Anything regarding our experience this evening?
I don't know. In it, I was a child, in a pit, like an arena with other children.
You were in a mansion, or maybe a palace. People were all around the pit, waiting in front of empty plates as you fought.
He said flatly. I fought off a terrible wave of nausea. Yes, that pit reminded me of this one.
It should. It's the same type of thing, the same idea.
He briskly dried his face.
You are uniquely talented. They are not, so they need other things, other ways.
I took a deep breath and held it. Like what?
I think you know.
He hung the towel and went back to the bedroom.
Come to bed.
I hesitated, which hurt him. The pain was evident in his posture.
Fine. Sleep where you like. Sleep in the office. Maybe your pets will help you remember who you are.
Don't be stupid. I tried to keep my voice steady, but failed miserably. I'm just tired. His expression softened a bit.
Let's sleep.
We did. At least, I did. It came fast, and it was deep and dreamless. I woke in the morning. The quality of the light was too pale and too golden for it to be anything but early, but I wasn't sleepy anymore. In fact, I was wide awake. I rolled over, reaching absently for Michael, but he wasn't there. I sat up and pulled at the rumpled covers to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Since more sleep was out of the question, I got up and checked the bathroom. No Michael. Figuring he was probably making breakfast, I put on a robe and left the room. As soon as I reached the top of the stairs, I heard voices. Michael's, of course, and someone else's, younger, far more emotional, and very familiar. Richard. Michael stood at the front door, blocking the entry. Richard was on the porch, every inch of him confrontational.
I remember everything.
His words were a curious combination of rage, fear, and triumph.
I know everything again.
Michael's voice, sharp by contrast, was smooth and dangerously level.
What do you expect from me? Does she...
Richard's voice became ragged.
Does she remember? No,
said Michael. They watched each other for what felt like a long time.
I'm going to tell her.
Richard stepped back quickly, as if preempting an attack.
You know what will happen. I don't know why you have a second chance, but I do know you won't get a third. She needs to know!
Richard's voice was raw again.
If she does, she will never forgive you. I know.
The words came out in a keening, weepy whine, one that reminded me of the girl in the restaurant, the stranger who'd begged me to protect her.
But... No!
Michael's voice was venom, cold and corrosive. He stepped back and prepared to close the door, but Richard launched himself forward and pulled it open.
What's wrong with you? Don't you want her to win?
That memory again, hideous and horrifying. This is how you win.
This isn't up to me, or to you.
A measured pause.
I can't stop you from doing whatever you see fit, but Richard, if you interfere, you will die.
He closed the door and stood until the last echo of Richard's motorcycle faded. Then he ran his hands through his hair and went down the hall to his office. I'm lost as ever. I don't think it's possible to find out the entire truth of things anymore. But I can try, and I know where to start. There are corpses in Michael's office, corpses that know things I have forgotten, corpses that want to speak. He's locked himself in there now, and I'm sure he'll lock it when he leaves, but that's all right. Locks won't keep me out anymore.